Great. I think we will get started there. So welcome to everyone who's joined us today for this VoxDev webinar on the future of foreign aid. I'm Oliver Hannay. I'm the managing editor here at VoxDev. And for those of you who might not have come across us before, we're a website that covers the latest economic research in low and middle income countries in a way that's accessible and focused on policy. I'm really excited to be joined today by Rachel Glennerster, who is the president of the Centre for Global Development and has previously served as chief economist at FCDO and DFID in the UK, and also as executive director of JPAL. We're also joined today by Stefan Dercon, who is a professor of economic policy at the Blavatnik School of Government and also the economics department at the University of Oxford. He's also the director of the Centre for the Study of African Economies and the academic director of an exciting new initiative called the Practical Politics Platform that aims to put the ideas from his book Gambling in Development into everyday practice. So the structure of today's session is going to be I'm first going to ask Rachel and Stefan to briefly outline some of their introductory thoughts. Then I'm going to ask some follow-up questions, and then we're going to leave plenty of time for questions from the audience. If you do have questions that you would like to see answered, you can use the Q&A function on Zoom, either to ask your own questions or vote on other people's questions if you'd like to see those answered. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Rachel.
Great, thanks, Oliver, and great to talk to everyone. So in this period when we are seeing dramatic cuts in aid, I think it's even more important to be spending our aid as effectively as possible. And the proposal that I put forward recently that came out of my work at DFID and FCDO was that we ought to think about radically simplifying how we work in aid. What do I mean by that? I mean work in fewer countries. Bilateral aid agencies should focus on doing fewer interventions and make their programs radically simpler. And interestingly, I've had many conversations with Dean Carlin, who is the chief economist at USAID, and he came, to exactly the same view, having experienced working in USAID. The problem that we both came across that sort of spurred this view is that many of the aid programs that we reviewed were, while they had elements in them that were based on good evidence and were funding interventions that were highly cost effective, they also led on a huge number of other things, sort of Christmas tree approach of adding many, many different components to a program. And there's an example that I think of when I think of this, and I feel bad about pulling this example out because it wasn't such a bad program, but it included, so it was a program for education in Nigeria, and it included money for teaching at the right level in a few hundred schools. But then it also included, regulation of private schools and fixing the management information system for education and many, many other components, including eventually village savings and loans programs, which really had nothing to do with the rest of the program. And when the problem is when you have these extremely complicated aid programs, it's hard to procure them because different people have expertise in savings and loans versus teaching at the right level. It's hard to evaluate them, and they are much less transparent. So when we went through the process of trying to, cut aid programs in response to declining GDP during COVID, you had this, hundreds and hundreds of programs to go through and see which ones you wanted to cut back on. And each one did many, many different things. It was very hard for ministers to kind of have a strategic sense about what they wanted to invest in. And as we try and make the case for aid, it's really important that people understand what the aid programs are doing. And it's extremely hard to explain to even ministers, let alone the general public, what aid is doing. And so my proposal is that bilateral aid agencies in particular, although I think this applies to multilateral organizations too, is that they should focus on a few things that are highly cost effective and do them at large scale, and just be known for and get good at doing those few things. This would mean that a much higher proportion of the money would get to beneficiaries, because at the moment we spend a lot of money, designing programs, and there's huge economies of scale. So we benefit from economies of scale. This has been shown by work by the IRC that you are much more cost effective if you reach a lot of people with one program. So we ensure more money get to beneficiaries. We benefit from economies of scale. It would be much easier to explain where aid was going, and we would make sure that we spent money on cost-effective things. Let me very briefly talk about some of the arguments against this idea. One is that different countries are different, and you ought to tailor programs to the needs of the individual country. And of course, that's true. But that doesn't mean that you as an aid agency need to do everything. Like, you can go to the places that need the thing that you're good at, right? So I give in the blog the example of severe, protocols for addressing severe childhood malnutrition. It's a cost-effective approach. Obviously, you don't go into a country where there aren't a large number of severely malnourished children, but there are a lot of countries where that is a problem. And therefore, if that's what you are expert in, you find the countries where that is needed, and you go there. And if there are children who are severely malnourished, this protocol is very good at addressing those needs. The other thing that people comment on about this approach is that poverty is multidimensional, and therefore you should address, all the different dimensions of poverty that someone is facing. And it is true that poverty is multidimensional, but that doesn't mean that one aid program should address all of those different challenges. And indeed, all of the research that has been done that shows that these interventions I'm talking about are highly cost effective have been done in isolation. They were tested in isolation. It's simply not the case that you have to address everything in order to get any progress, because the research shows that that's not the case, because in each of these evaluations, only one thing was addressed, and there were huge returns to addressing that thing. And finally, let me just say about a lot of agencies, as they cut back, are thinking about working on systems rather than interventions. I mean, we can get into this in more detail in the discussion, but systems, health systems, education systems, that term is used to cover a whole lot of different things. And so, for example, in education systems, a lot of the issues around systems in education are about pedagogy and how do you teach. And so some of these interventions that are highly cost effective are about how do you teach, and therefore they are, in a sense, systems interventions. So I don't see this as contrary to working on systems. It's just choosing the right intervention to improve the system. Okay, back to you, Oliver.
Thanks. Well, I'll hand straight over to Stefan to outline some of his thoughts, and then I'll have some follow-up questions.
Right. Well, thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Oliver. Look, allow me to take a little bit of a step back. When these aid cuts were now hitting, and of course with the USAID cuts, it becomes really big. I had lived through FCDO cuts before and so on, but then, with the US also cutting back, we saw a lot happening. And I suppose there's three things that really concerned me, and of which some of which I had not really thought as much before in terms of the way we are doing it. And I'll touch on a few things that Rachel is mentioning, but the first thing that really, and I must say it actually kind of shocked me, how after essentially doing for 60 years the aid business, how indispensable we had made ourselves. Or put it slightly differently, all the writing, and which is true, we were doing with aid very essential programs, not just in humanitarian settings, but also in settings where, yes, states were not perfect, but somehow we were doing it. You know, USAID was spending, I understand from a blog from CGD, I think 3 times as much on health than the government itself was spending on health in Malawi. So we were doing very essential things. And yes, the withdrawal of it, it appears that it is really risking a lot of lives. It's essential things, it's vaccine distribution, it's essential medicine that goes away, and so on. But beyond outrage in that I feel that money is going and people are put at risk, I do think that we should be self-critical and saying, how did we get after 60 years ourselves still in a position that we are indispensable, that some of the most crucial things appear to be delivered in the Malawis of the world through aid? Okay? It links to a second point I want to make. The indispensability may well have been linked with an increased push of bilateral and to some extent multilateral, where, you know, for very good reasons, we had to be not just be, but also be able to show that we were extremely aid effective. And we ended up designing a lot of the aid systems to serve the donors. Maybe to some extent do good for the beneficiaries, and I will be definitely there in favor, but maybe we did more good for the beneficiaries than actually finding a way, however difficult it is, to contributing to actually do development, to make ourselves over time dispensable. Indeed, we did an awful lot in parallel systems. We did a lot in, you know, things that we said, look, here we can guarantee that it's most effective, which is okay, but that's part of that first problem I alluded to of indispensability, and that we actually were designing it probably more to serve the donor interest to some extent than actually we had in view of, do we make this something that, you know, changes things and makes it in a sense what we tend to call development. And then the third thing is, and I think it's to some extent related, is that the aid community had an element of a savior complex, that we needed to try to solve the problems wherever there is needs. And actually, in that sense, I'm closer also to some of the things that Rachel is saying, is that we pushed a lot. There is a problem, and it's a bit like, I've worked in government long enough. We see a problem, or therefore we throw some money at it. And we do a needs-based allocation of trying to do good, where we don't have in mind how can we use the scarce resources we have in development, in aid, most effectively. Now, some of that effectiveness is in line about, you know, don't do stupid things, but try to do things that have high return. But there is another part of effectiveness in the way that I want to use it, is that actually does it contribute to development? And my strong view is that if you want it to contribute to development, you have to find a way of working with the, you know, with the big agents of development in a country. That includes the state. And you need to be able to work with places where there is at least a political will to make it effective. Doing it in parallel effective has far less longer term return for development than finding a way of making it effective, responding to you know, the political realities on the ground. And that means effectiveness may well have had to mean not a needs-based allocation, but maybe a much more selective one in places where there is actually a willingness of local partners to use for a while the aid and actually build it up, but then actually make ourselves dispensable. So put it in short, I think for me, the three things that are important if we start thinking, trying to make sense of where aid can go over time, is that can we think more about how to make ourselves dispensable and not indispensable? Make ourselves much more, rather than trying to work narrowly obsessed with we need to be effective with this money alone, trying to think really about the complementarity. Scale will comes into it, and there was a few days after Rachel wrote a blog on CGD, Bini and Badass also put one out on CGD, a blog. We're actually making the argument maybe we should allocate aid much more complementary to where the government is trying to spend its money, and to actually look for complementarity and definitely not a parallel substitute. That maybe the parallel substitute may be in the short run more effective, but really looking for complementarities and doing it. And then third, related, I do think we need to be willing to be more selective, because if we want to be impactful, we need to do this responding to, well, in the best case scenario, where the political will is. And if it's not perfect, try to understand how can we work with the grain within the politics to move it actually forward. So we can't do needs-based, but we have to be much more willing to be selective. So dispensable, complementary for scale, and then trying to be selective, not parallel. And that's the kind of three things maybe I want to open with.
Thank you both. So the first question I was going to ask, which alludes to the radically simple framework that you outlined, Rachel and Stefan, you slightly touched on it in that answer, but the work you've done in your book around kind of thinking about the political constraints that countries face and then giving them the best advice based on their constraints. I wanted to ask you both how you feel those fit together, and whether those visions of aid are complementary or there's some conflicts in there, in terms of doing something that's radically simple and also politically viable. So I was wondering if either of you could comment on that.
Happy to come in. So I think, Stefan's push for us to think in terms of political economy, I think is very useful. I think, as economists, we're trying to think about incentives. So if you're talking to governments and bureaucrats, politicians or bureaucrats about the evidence and trying to persuade them to do the things for which there's evidence, you have to be thinking about their incentives, right? I mean, that's just, how we're trained and how we ought to be thinking about things. So in some ways, I feel like it's so ingrained in what a lot of development economists do that we don't often talk about it. But I think Stefan's right, we should talk about it because it's really important that you think about the incentives of the people you're talking to, what the needs of the country that you're working in. And the way I see it is you're trying to find a match. You're trying to find a match between what you're good at providing as a donor, because you're not good at doing a lot of things, and what is highly cost effective to do, and what is in the interests of a given government or bureaucracy to do. So you want to choose the country where there's a match, be selective, as Stefan said, go where there is a hope that people will embrace this and believe in doing it and want to do it on their own. You can choose a sector where there's a minister that is, willing to listen to evidence and wants to get something done. And sometimes you need to adjust the program for political constraints, but you have to be quite careful about, when that's the right thing to do. And I mean, I'll give you an example. I just got back from Côte d'Ivoire, where I'm working and chair of the board of an NGO that supports countries to do teaching at the right level. And that was originally evaluated using native language. which there's evidence is a much better way to teach. But in Côte d'Ivoire, they are going to teach in French. Like that is just a political reality that you have to work around. And therefore the teaching at the right level work is done in French. So I think it's, I see these as very compatible. I think sometimes, I don't want to read too much into what Stefan is saying, but I think, obviously he's done a lot of work on what are the most cost-effective things to do, and his own research is about evidence and has some brilliant examples of things that has come out of his work that I think should be on our list of about mindsets that should be on our list of highly effective things to do. I think maybe where he gets a little concerned with my approach is having central globalized lists of what is highly cost effective. But I think that is a very useful tool for the people who are going in to try and figure out how to do a match. So I'll give you an example. A lot of people in the World Bank know that computers, it's the example he has in his blog of, countries wanting to spend money on computers. And a lot of the education folks know that just buying computers for classrooms is not very cost effective. They have told me that it can be useful in their discussions to be able to say, that's actually on the list of bad buys for education. It's going to be a little difficult for me to get that through the review process when I go home. It's not going to change Uhuru Kenyatta's view on computers, right? But in some situation, because we all knew that he was going in with this big political promise and to provide computers, and there's a lot of reason why it's politically nice. But what you're doing is you're giving ammunition to people to push back to some extent when everyone knows that it's a bad waste of money. Okay.
No, it's great. I mean, look, let me. There's a lot of what you say, of course, Rachel, that I agree with, and that can do it. But let me try to put it a bit sharper where I would become a bit concerned, and in the way also my introductory comments were around it when we are advocating for the simplicity and the cost effectiveness, the list of cost and of the most cost effective, the highest impact interventions and focus that around aid. Okay, so I don't think we would disagree at all that the world we would like to live in is that, say, the government of Malawi and the government of Ethiopia would allocate its resources as much as we could by these lists. Okay, and I think, but if that's the objective, I am a little bit concerned that actually aid is the one that uses the list for itself. And for this, for two reasons. And it doesn't have to happen, and I'm sure you'll have a good answer to that. But it's for two reasons. And it's this, and it links to the simple, and it links to the kind of legitimacy of aid. So one of the things that I really got concerned in Malawi is an example. How many of the essential services seem to be financed in the end now by aid, and often evidence-based and so on. Now, one of the things is that what we really would want is that the government uses its own resources on the most effective things. So if we come in with aid and say, no, we have to be the ones that do these things because that gives us legitimacy to our donors and to our funders. Therefore, don't worry about it. I'll do vaccines for you. I'll do the most primary health care. I do the kind of things. And this is where I get worried, because we do this for a long time and we may really risk something that is so crucial in countries like Malawi, where the political will to do the right things is not that big, is that actually we're actually taking away a source of potential legitimacy for the local fiscal contracts between government and the citizens. Because the most effective things, it's the outsiders doing it. And we give, of course, at the same time, I worry about it, and I've always worried, say, in places like Northern Nigeria with it, where we've done health programs for 60 years as the UK, that actually we don't make them, we basically given up on it. It's these kind of things that I heard also in South Sudan, where a finance minister thanked me. Thank you for DFID, because thanks to you, we don't have to worry about health and education in our country. And so it's these incentives that we have to be careful with. And so the aim should be we should try to find mechanisms, and that's maybe where we would disagree where the best mechanism is, to actually get these countries with their own public finance using these lists of what are the highest impactful things that they should build in. And I'm just all the time concerned that us leading on that takes it away. I have a little story that I really still like to tell us in the time of also at my time at DFID as chief economist, going to Ethiopia. The team wanted to do a particular program. It was a little bit to do because the ministers love property rights programs. We were going to do a property rights program and so on. But I will never forget what the advisor to the prime minister told me when we explained what we wanted to do and said, look, would it be okay if aid will pay for this? The UK aid will pay for it. And he said, look, actually, I like it so much that I rather have us paying for it ourselves. And I think that's what you kind of want to cultivate as the kind of thing in it. And it relates to that other part, which is the simplicity, which does concern me. There is one level I totally agree with you. You know, in my time at DFID, I wrote a paper, Small is Not Beautiful, where basically, you know, the very simple things, if you can have economies of scale, you have to go for economies of scale with anything we do. And small is not beautiful. However, if we go and say simple with very clear lines of accountability and so on, simple gets quickly interpreted in our systems as, oh, we'll better take control of the whole delivery line, a beautiful parallel system, and so on. And so we need to make sure that simple still means that it's not just some kind of parallel thing that again is make ourselves indispensable, but also it doesn't really does the things that you argued for earlier as well in terms of building systems and so on. So we want to be careful that these things don't get misinterpreted on the simplicity. But I definitely am worried about if 8 does the most effective things of the lists, well, are we then saying and public finance will do the second list and the third list and so on? Then the other part of it, you know, on the political economy part, that's maybe a final comment, you know, there it is, we just have to be willing to be more conscious. And I think bilateral aid, at least the UK side, never did it too badly. There was always a good negotiation, trying to think who were the champions and trying to do this. I see a lot of other bilateral aid, and maybe dare I say multilateral aid, that tries to be basically saying, well, we are going to be, you know, even thinking about politics is interference, so we'll don't even think about it, and we'll just do technically designed in the space. I don't think that's the way to go. And I probably, when I say, look, take into account the political economy, you need to have these champions. It does put a burden on all these technical people that keep on brought in and say, look, you know, just don't try to design something that is perfect, but actually take into account the incentives. You know, you need to have champions, otherwise, you know, we won't even achieve the effectiveness that on paper we could even get with some of the best interventions.
Thank you both. So I'm gonna use my time to ask one more question, and then we will turn to the Q&A, which is already filling up with some great questions. Some of which my question will cover. So I wanted to ask about what we are at risk of losing if we kind of pursue these approaches. So Rachel, one point that was raised in a post I saw on LinkedIn by Amber Peterman was that many important areas, such as tackling child sexual abuse, human trafficking, violence against women, and others, are very difficult to track in terms of cost effectiveness. And it would be interesting to hear your reflections on how or whether radical simplification, as you have proposed, might undermine those efforts, or how you would try and incorporate kind of work that's important but difficult to do a cost effectiveness evaluation of. And a question to both of you, in terms of the future of foreign aid, there's obviously been a big move recently on kind of localization, and do the current changes risk kind of rolling back on progress that's been made, if there has been any progress made in kind of involving local actors more in the allocation of aid. So maybe Rachel, do you want to start, and then Stefan, you can come in, and then we will turn to the audience.
Sure. I mean, there's a lot there, so I might not cover it all, but let me first make clear one thing. I really don't believe in vertical programs. So, Stefan's worry that simplification means vertical programs and is, I mean, maybe that's a worry, but it's certainly not the version of simplification that I'm talking about. Again, the example of where I've just come back from Côte d'Ivoire, this is very much a government-run program, but donors or other outside funding is funding some of the training for local teachers to do the new pedagogy, right? But it's all actually, the training is done by government trainers, and it's part of the ministry's like overall program. So very much on the ground, you wouldn't even really notice that it wasn't a government program. It's interesting, this point about if donors do the most cost effective, then does the government do the least cost effective thing? There's some really interesting work in the health program in CGD about this, which is arguing that you ought to go into a country in health and do an assessment like with the government. The government does an assessment of what are the health needs, and you figure out what the budget should be spent on what's the most cost effective things, and then the government does those and the donors do the marginal thing. So it's some very interesting work. I think that that's politically impossible for donors to say they're going to do the least cost effective thing. I do think, though, that the right way to do this is a joint discussion between the donors and the government, like we used to have in sectoral support, where you assess what are the needs of the country, what are the most cost effective, what's the total budget envelope, and so it's a government plan, much as the education plan that we're feeding into in the Ivory Coast is a government plan. And then you agree between the donors and the government what the plan is, what you're going to spend it on, and then the donors fund some parts. And to be frank, normally, I mean, Malawi is a bit of a special case. In most countries, donors are pretty small percentage of the funds. Most of the money in development is being spent by developing country governments themselves. So I think there are very particular situations where donors are a very big proportion, and there we have to think a little bit differently about it. Let me get onto your question, Oliver, and let me take the hard to measure thing, because I think that's really difficult and important. So there's a list of things which are, where you've had like 10 randomized trials, and you really know that they're highly cost effective, and you've looked at impact very carefully. When I was in government, though, we did these lists of kind of best buys in different sectors. And in some sectors, you just couldn't have that kind of evidence. So we drew on lots of other kinds of evidence. So, an example is infrastructure. It's very hard to have, randomized trials on infrastructure, but there's a lot of data and evidence that you can pull in on. And, we talked about rural roads, and you can look at, that actually with transport, there's more evidence that linking hubs is really cost effective, but, there's much less evidence about rural roads. On electrification, there's more evidence that it helps firms. And that's not from RCTs, because it's very hard to do RCTs from firms. But there's lots of other evidence you can pull in. So I think when we talk about this, I'm not just, there's a lot of forms of evidence that you can use that are not, to look at things which are not RCTable.
So yeah, let me just touch on these points so briefly. I mean, definitely agreement is breaking out here because we you made the case for budget support, and of course in some sense that's where you can see, because this is obviously, if you can get into a setting, into a setting where you can find a way of sufficient, to use an overused word, ownership of the government, of the underlying plans and the ideas of what they want to do, whether it's in a sector or when on a reform program, whatever, then of course that's dilemma. Who does the most cost effective doesn't come into it, because you just put it all in the same envelope and the fungibility will do its job. Of course, one of the things is that virtually no bilateral donor is willing to do this anymore. Um, and linked to it, because they do like this control, and I do worry about the simplicity will be interpreted as a chain of control as well, and a parallel. So we need to make sure people don't misunderstand. And you made your point very clear there, Rachel, on that. I mean, I also think vertical fonts are a big mistake. Are basically just another word of actually saying we're not really. I mean, that's literally not trying to build up the systems, okay? So that's literally consciously having your own chain of things. But to come back on the budget support thing, where it gets a bit unstuck is that it's not quite clear that we would want to propose that in Malawi, or could propose that in Malawi, not just because the donors don't want to do it, but and not and I saw in the questions, so Malawi, surely it's too poor to do its own thing, so we should do it ourselves. Actually, Ethiopia, Rwanda, there's other countries as well that were similarly poor at points where actually you could do what Rachel described, where you could get together and get some plans on doing it. Malawi's problem is not because it has low state capacity, because it's poor. It's by design. It's a political economy issue. They don't want to do it. So it's not so clear what we would be doing there. And of course, it leads a bit to my selectivity, and I can only repeat that once. I think Roy Stewart once said it publicly, that we had a very lively discussion at the time I was advising him, shall we just walk away from Malawi? Because we don't see this ability to find the political will to do essentially what would be a budget support program, and otherwise it's just there. Now, I'm not trying to say we need to have a debate whether you should walk away or not here, but there is just not a political will. But for me, it comes back to using aid, even if it's focusing on certain things within it, but as complementary to the public finance involved. And so Binyam Badasso at CGD was doing it on education. I will definitely look for the health work at CGD, because I clearly seem to agree intuitively, at least before reading it, but we should have a look at it. But it definitely is a way of creating far more legitimacy in the countries for what the government is providing as services, because and that's definitely, we need to find a way of doing this in many more places. Let me stop there. I could say more. Yeah.
Great. So I'm gonna turn to some of the questions. I mean, we've already had 30, so we're not gonna get round to all of them, but a couple that I'll start with. So we've had one question about basically these narratives that you're putting forward kind of making sense and seeming to be persuasive, but also saying that they are kind of framed as in a way that economists will understand and like, but maybe don't fit into the current direction that aid is going, which is kind of more tied into foreign policy and politicized. So I guess the question is, how do you see the kind of arguments you're laying out fitting in to a world where aid and partnerships are more politicized? And then we also had a question from Sam Carter, who's asked about where within the aid system exactly there are these incentives against reducing the need for aid, which is something that you kind of talked about, Stefan. So, are there kind of examples of people who are working to ensure that aid continues to be a necessary piece of the global ecosystem? or is it kind of something that they are contributing towards, but they don't realize that that's what they're doing, and how we can focus our efforts to kind of change that situation. So yeah, I'll stop there because they're quite big questions, but we'll start with those two.
Who should start? Rachel?
Okay, I'm happy to go again if we. Um, so let me talk about the foreign policy and not fitting with the current direction. So it's interesting. We've had a lot of discussion in CGD about the underlying, we need to rebuild the underlying consensus, political consensus for aid in rich countries, and how to do that. And I think part of that is talking about foreign policy, but I don't think we should stop the argument for aid, which is about, we care and we can help people. Because it's very interesting when you look at a lot of the rhetoric coming out of some governments, it's very much about aid needs to be in the national interest, it needs to lead to jobs in the US or the UK. And yet, when, for example, that was very much the rhetoric around the cutting of aid in the US, but what were the programs that survived the cuts? They were the direct life-saving humanitarian programs. And had some feedback recently that some of the numbers about showing how many people were going to die as a result, has had some impact on this administration in pushing through waivers. So we need to, and that is actually what the general public's view, if you ask them about why they support aid, their main concern is actually about whether aid is used effectively rather than wanting it to lead to jobs in the UK. And to some extent, you risk undermining people's faith that aid actually helps the poorest if you get into making it too kind of self-interested, because then people think, oh, the aid is just going to, rich corporations. So it's a difficult balancing act when you talk about the rationale for aid, because you have to bring in both of these elements, the kind of foreign policy element. And yes, there are foreign policy constraints. I mean, under Boris Johnson, we made the argument to go into Francophone Africa because of security issues, but we had a very strong pushback of no, we want to stay with Commonwealth countries, and that was clearly a foreign policy issue. But there's plenty you can do in Anglophone Africa, right? So that element of it is not too much of a constraint. I think diverting aid too much to be about jobs in rich countries, it does risk undermining the other support for it.
Yeah, let me add to that. As I'm reminded, this the push to be relevant for the UK economy or for a particular country's a donor country's economy, or the push to serve transactional political foreign policy goals. Of course, it's nothing new. I mean, it's been going on for quite some time, and more and more. And it's I was reminded at some point, look, if you if you really think you can make the argument for aid based on the contribution to growth and jobs in the UK, well, it's obviously the case that take all the aid away and build an airport or a third runway at Heathrow is probably going to have a bigger economic impact than all the kind of foreign aid you can do. This is actually a self-defeating way of trying to argue around it. And I know ministers often tend to ask, and politicians tend to ask, we need to show that it's beneficial for us, but it's a self-defeating argument. The same on the migration side. These arguments in due course get self-defeating, and I think I agree there with Rachel that the politicization, in that sense, the kind of taking a local political lens there. Now, it doesn't make it easier, and of course the um, in a world where those people, the political leadership in donor countries wants to use it politically, um, it is a bit of a battle. But I should be willing to use my own frameworks then for this as well. It is going to be a second best. There's going to be, you may actually be constrained where you can do it, but a second best is actually still possible. You may have political constraints, just as I remember there was a time we couldn't do cash transfer programs anymore except for in humanitarian settings. I found it a constraint because it's a very effective way. And if we find a government that wants to expand them, we couldn't necessarily do it with different money. So there is a constraining factor there, but I rather see it as a constraint that you say, okay, let's then get the best, the most effective thing, still and promote that. And in a country where government really has the political will to work with you on that, rather than trying to make up some vague story that we're going to do an employment program so it will stop migration, where there is neither evidence, no real demand anywhere, and it's all just storytelling. But maybe coming back a bit, and I like this question that came in from saying, look, these people who that I if I alluded to the fact that we made ourselves indispensable, I don't see this as some kind of conspiracy of officials in organizations. How do we make ourselves indispensable? I don't think so. I think we're talking a lot about unintended consequences. I fear that these unintended consequences, i.e., that we end up doing more in, say, parallel systems, more in particular ways of the most essential things and so on, because we couldn't find another way, our politicians couldn't find another way of selling it to their constituencies that they were doing these things. So that there's a bit of a double-edged sword here that actually it's plausible. I'm not entirely sure in the UK it always worked, but it's plausible that in some context, definitely humanitarian aid, life-saving aid in the humanitarian sense, definitely has a lot of public appeal virtually in every country in the surveys. But expanding this to cover everything on development as a way of selling it, I worry that it can lead to a kind of a very short term, let's just deliver these short term results, these outcomes, without thinking of how it feeds into locally into the kind of indispensability, a form of, I'm not calling it aid dependency, but more an excuse for those people who can't be bothered not to have to do it. Create incentives basically of neglecting primary healthcare or certain things in essential things. I think I see it more like this, that it's an unintended consequence from the pressure of keeping aid flows going and being justified. And I do think I would want us to think a bit more about it, because I do think that if we're in 30 years still doing this in the same way and the same struggles we have, there must be something. If we're still in Malawi in 30 years in not very different way, then I think something is been going wrong. So there has to be thinking about, that of how to overcome these multiple incentives that we need to respond to.
Great. So a couple other questions we've had through. So we've had one from Nick Ricketts about the radical simplification framework, which he asks. He says that the framework would seem to rely on coordination amongst donor organizations and multilaterals to manage kind of overlaps and gaps. And how could that coordination be achieved or effectively done? And then another question from John Anderson, who says, given the demise of ODA, how can the lessons learned from ODA be applied to some of the remaining financial flows of DFI and also remittances to make them more effective and efficient? So I'll let either of you come in on those two questions.
Shall I for one start, Rachel? It creates maybe, then you can criticize me as well. The I mean, so the first thing is that look, that whatever we're talking about and may agree or disagree on anything, I mean, everything could do with much more coordination between donors. Okay, it is at times quite ridiculous. Okay, so it is ridiculous that in my time, definitely in DFID and FCDO, asking country office, do you know exactly what the others are doing, the other donors are doing? And usually long silences would follow, and they would be talking about some vague things. Coordination is in any case needed, whatever we look for, whether it's for overlap, for gaps, for competition, for patronizing behavior, for whatever it is. But my point here, actually, I would want to be on the coordination, is that given that aid flows have reduced, and the bilateral aid flows are reducing, and there is a commitment, for example, from the UK to spend more from multilaterals, I can see bilateral aid should actually be seen much more. I mean, I should add to it, if there are large flows in a country, and not all countries have large flows, but it comes largely from multilaterals, definitely from the banks, from the multilateral development banks. Seeing bilateral aid much more also as complementary to these fundings, and looking for ways to making the return to multilateral programs. In my case also, because bilaterals can be a bit more political, can be more responsive for places where there's political will or not. Multilateral flows are typically a bit done by as a cooperative bank, more or less. Everybody gets their share. So the bilaterals, they can actually be a bit more selective and making the return and responding to windows opportunities. So I see it there, but that again would need coordination and so on. The second thing with the demise of ODI, I think the death of ODI is overstated here. It's not entirely gone. And we should just be conscious there will still be considerable flows. Even if it's halved, it will still be more than 20 years ago. Or 10 years ago even. DFIs, okay, talking about it. I would just want to pick on remittances. I think there is a naive idea sometimes about remittances. They're not targeted. They're going to people who have people overseas. There's definitely a flow from a macroeconomic point of view. I know, say in some countries like in Pakistan, it's essential for the balance of payments. It's essential for a lot of people. But to say it compensates for it, or we see this as an alternative to, no, I see aid largely as a complement or an addition to public finance in a country, to public resources. Remittances never are. That's a private resource that comes in a particular way for all kinds of reasons. It's great that they come, and I'm all a big fan of allowing people to migrate and earn incomes and sending them back. But it's not about substitutes here. There's very little that I can say. Maybe Rachel has more to add on that.
Great. Let me talk about the coordination point. I think coordination is great. It's really hard to do. I think it's best done where you can do this kind of framework work that we were talking about, which we used to do as budget support. We used to all put our money together in a pot and agree with the government what the plan was. I agree that that's really hard. The political economy of that in rich countries is very hard, because then basically anything the government spends money on, you can get blamed for in the press. UK aid money went to this thing, for anything that the government does. So that's probably not coming back anytime soon. But you can still do work with the government and the aid agencies involved in coming up with a plan of what are the most cost-effective things to do, and then go round and people say, well, I'll do that, and I'll do that, and I'll do that. So they still get a slice of the cake, but the cake is baked, in one go, as opposed to all separately. So that's ideally how you would do it. And, the World Bank has these consultative meetings where they try and bring people together. That's made really hard by the fact that at the moment you might have 20 different donors trying to sit around the table. Whereas if we specialized more and worked in fewer countries, then you would have to coordinate many fewer donors in any given sector in any given country, because at the moment we kind of each spread ourselves really thin across many sectors and many countries, and then coordination becomes an absolute nightmare. So part of simplification would make the coordination better. I wanted to bring on one thing where I think there's an important comparative advantage between multilateral and bilateral donors. Given that Stefan raised this, I think, and it's something I've been meaning to say and haven't managed to get in yet, which is there's a really important role for bilateral agencies in doing knowledge generation. So I've talked about you should do these few cost-effective things. But in addition, in my blog, I say, how do you know what the next cost-effective thing is? Well, you need to be investing in knowledge generation and research, and not just research like what economists do, but also research into new seeds and new vaccines. And that's something which it's very hard to do through multilateral agencies because they, somewhere like the World Bank is working with a particular country and lending money to a particular country. So they can't fund research into a new malaria vaccine, which covers many countries. And an individual country isn't going to invest in it because they're all small and it's a public good. So this is something that is really a comparative advantage of bilateral donors and something which I'm very worried the current cuts are going to really cut back on.
Great. Well, thank you both for sharing your insights today. I think we're coming to the end of the hour, so I think we will leave the questions there. Sorry that we didn't get round to all of them, but there was way too many to. But hopefully we covered a lot of them, and I can certainly see some of the questions that are actually answered by the blogs that Stefan and Rachel have recently written. So I'm just going to quickly put a link in the chat to those so that you can go and check out those blogs directly, because I'm sure that many of the questions will be answered by those. I would also quickly give a self promotion to our VoxDev webinar on Thursday, which is celebrating the launch of our new VoxDev Lit on electricity infrastructure, which is one of these harder to do RCT topics. But the VoxDev Lit by Robin Meeks has kind of explored all of the evidence that we have from economic research on the impacts of electricity infrastructure and how you can kind of build that out in a way that's politically and economically viable. So I've also put the link for that in the chat. And again, a huge thanks to Stefan and Rachel for joining us today. And thanks to all of those who have joined and asked great questions. Thank you both.
Yep. All right.